Hello and welcome to this video on how to get your azaleas to grow a better nebari, or perhaps we should say develop better nebari. We're going to assume that you're starting from scratch, that is to say you have completely new nursery stock. The reason for this is relatively simple. Everything we do with this is something you can apply to more developed examples of your own if you have them, or if you are interested in developing your nebari in an azalea and developing a more significant specimen of your own, you can do so. The development approaches we'll show you will account for things like typical characteristics, the fact they are often compact, have tangled root balls, and a lack of defined root surfaces. The structure just hasn't been developed for a bonsai yet. Azaleas coming from a nursery are more or less always grown for garden use, so their roots are often dense and optimized for pot culture rather than bonsai aesthetics. This is going to be a problem, one we can fix, but a problem. So, we'll give you a reasonably in-depth guide tailored specifically for developing nebari and new nursery stock azaleas, and we want to focus more on the initial stages and setting a foundation for long-term success, rather than saying, here are your immediate results, because immediate results tend to be very limited. Nursery stock azalea, otherwise known as Rhododendron indicum or Rhododendron obtusum, have a variety of varieties. The Satsuki azaleas are the best choice typically speaking. They are well developed, they have good ratio, they match everything you'd want in a bonsai. They nearly always come in a very small container, and there's little to no visible nebari. Basically, it looks like a twig stuck in the ground. What we want to do is take this from the very raw, very, let's say, unsuitable material for bonsai, and change it into something aesthetically pleasing. Our key considerations will be root condition. Basically, we're expecting to see a tight root ball with circling or downward growing roots that are going to need to be corrected. Health is another problem along with vigor. The nursery stock is generally healthy, but, bonsai approaches tend to be very different to what bonsai care involves. And of course, time. Developing a nebari from nursery stock can take anywhere from 5 to 10 years, and the first 3 years or so are going to be primarily working on establishing a radial root pattern. That is, roots growing out towards the edges of the pot rather than down and then getting all tangled. So, we'll start with the easiest of the steps, choosing good stock. And literally, this is the first thing you need to consider. You need to assess and then select the right plant. A promising specimen is going to be an azalea with a thick trunk base, even if it is small, and a healthy canopy. A thicker trunk would suggest a more developed root system with potential for nebari. So these are your signs. Look for something thick at the base, thicker if you can, but thick as possible. Next, we want to look at the base itself. Start poking around in the soil near the trunk to check for any visible roots. A few promising roots can be a good starting point, although not always necessary. We can work on that. And of course, try and avoid overly root-bound plants if you can. If the roots are particularly matted, or if the plant looks stressed, yellowing leaves, weak growth, it's probably going to need recovery time before nebari work begins. We can start with root work and preparation. The first major root work is going to be done in early spring, more or less just before new growth starts. Typically speaking, February to March in most northern hemisphere locations. Obviously, this will be somewhere around September, October, November in the southern hemisphere. Inverse to the northern hemisphere. This is when azaleas recover best from any disturbances to their roots. In warmer climates, you might want to start this work in late winter rather than spring, as obviously warmer locations tend to have an earlier start to spring and the work will be less horrifying to the azalea. So, start by bare rooting it. Remove the azalea completely from its nursery pot and gently wash away all of the soil. The easiest way to do this is to take it out of its pot and, holding the bottom of the root mass and the top of the soil, gently lower it into the water. Let the water soak through the soil and then slowly bob it up and down with your hands, slowly shaking free any soil that you can, trying not to submerge the actual trunk and leaves of the azalea. Gradually do this until you've removed the majority of the soil. You may then want to consider either new water and repeating the cycle, or taking a hose and gently washing the remaining of the root mass free of any soil. If you still find that there is soil present, chopsticks or a root hook can be used to tease the roots out without breaking them. Now that we're looking at it, you should have a rather, let's say, a dense fibrous root ball with a lot of circulating roots. This is not good. You want to be patient to avoid damaging the fine azalea roots that azaleas need by gently teasing them out with a root rake, hook, or similar. Now that we have all of the roots ideally hanging free and down, they will first of all look substantially longer than they were before, but also you can see the difference in structure. So, first of all, cut away any undesirable roots. These will be thick vertical taproots and also any circling or crossing roots that won't contribute to the nebari. These are roots that will often dominate nursery stock and they will prevent radial spread, so they need to go. You want to retain the finer roots. Keep as many of these fine, thin, fibrous roots as possible, especially those that are closest to the trunk, as these can develop into surface roots. And finally, you do need to be selective is perhaps not the right word, but careful in how much root mass you remove. For nursery stock, you want to remove no more than 30, maybe 40% at a push of the root mass in the first repotting, and this is to avoid shocking the plant. Typically speaking, this is more than less consistent with, let's say, most bonsai approaches, where you remove about a third of the root ball. Now, some species can tolerate more, but as is obvious from now, that azaleas are not so tolerant of that approach. Now that we have the roots dealt with, we can look at the canopy. You want to just lightly prune the foliage back. You want to look at about 20 to 30% reduction in the canopy mass. And this is mostly just to balance the root reduction and reduce stress. You don't want to prune heavily, as a nursery stock will need time to adjust, but you do want to remove some of the canopy mass. It's just simply that the root mass that you've now reduced it to can't support all that extra growth. Now, to encourage radial root development, you want to use something like, say, a wide pot, a tile, something relatively solid, and plant over this. The tile method is one of the more common methods, and we've shown you this before with other examples, but what you do is you place a large, flat, solid object, say a ceramic tile, a piece of wood, plastic, even a piece of metal if you need to, under the azalea. You then put a little bit of soil over this, a thin layer, so that it's not directly sitting on the solid object, and then you want to put holes through this if it doesn't already have them. And this allows for the trunk to pass through it, but it means that the growth underneath it is flat. Essentially, you're creating an artificial shallow pot. This allows the roots to spread wide and then go down underneath, ensuring that the root mass that is growing, let's say, on the surface has to grow flat. There's no way to avoid that. They will eventually grow over the tile and look more like spokes on a wheel. You may need to secure them with some sort of wire or string. Sometimes this isn't necessary. Once you've got this in place, you then put a little more soil over the roots again, 1 to 2 centimeters, or somewhere in the range of about 1/3 to 1/2 of an inch or thereabouts, and this allows them to remain moist and alive, but also thicken. The alternative is simply a shallow pot. This works sort of just as well, but not quite. It has its limitations. A wide shallow pot will encourage the same sort of lateral root growth and avoid deep roots. Now, you want to wire the roots if you haven't already used string or similar. This is mostly to bring those promising roots closer to the surface. You want to gently wire them with aluminium or copper wire, bonsai wire. Try to avoid steel, but sometimes needs must. So, once you have them in a radial pattern, be cautious, as the azalea roots are delicate, and correcting poor root placement is somewhat more challenging. If there are no surface roots, you probably need to rely on developing future root growth now, and that's done by spreading the available roots as evenly as possible around your azalea bonsai, and planning for various advanced techniques in the future, root grafting for example. Now we need to look at the initial care. You want to be using a well-draining acidic mix suited for azaleas, so 70% kanuma, which is a Japanese volcanic soil with a acidic pH, 20% peat moss, and 10% perlite or some sort of coarse sand. If you don't have access to something like kanuma, you can use 50% peat moss, 30% perlite, and 20% pine bark. This achieves most of the same results without any of the loss, let's say. The pine bark is necessary for the acidity, but if you have something like sulfur available, you can make up the difference without using pine bark, But just be aware that you'll need to test for acidity to make sure you've got roughly the right range, let's say. For potting purposes, well, place the azalea on the tile as we've described, and you want to make sure the trunk is at or just slightly above the soil surface to encourage those surface roots. Fill the soil and work it gently between the roots that you've planted out. You want to avoid air pockets because air pockets are places that roots can't grow very well, and it means you need to repot that much sooner. Watering is, at least at this stage, fairly straightforward. Water thoroughly after repotting, and then if you need to, add more soil. This is often because the soil will compact down considerably. Now once you've done this, let it sit for a little while so that all the excess water can drain away. You don't want the water to be soggy, you want it to be moist. Azaleas do not like excessive water, so good drainage is essential. Now for fertilization, you're going to have to wait. Waiting 4 to 6 weeks after repotting is about right. You can try and use something like, say, root promoting products like various tonics and similar, but don't use a fertilizer. Once it is reasonably established at that 4 to 6 week mark, you can look at using a low nitrogen balanced fertilizer. Essentially, you want something that's something like, say, a 1-1-1 or similar ratio, and you use this roughly every 2 to 3 weeks during the growing season. This is what's going to promote your steady root growth and ensure that those roots develop nice solid mass and build on that trunk. Make sure to keep your azalea in somewhere shaded as well. Azaleas do not like excessive heat, and the stress, given everything you've done on top of that, will basically kill them. Also, protect it from strong winds, extreme temperature changes, things like this, your usual protection for a bonsai. Now, in your first year, you have some pretty straightforward goals. Those radial roots. And that will be your primary goal. You want to get the roots to spread outward rather than downward. This is why you went to all the effort of planting it over those shallow pots or on that tile. You want to promote health because you've just done a lot of work to this poor azalea, and the azalea is probably panicking. You want to ensure it's got partial shape and enough light to grow and minimal disturbance. And just make sure that as you're letting it go, that you keep an eye on it. You want to watch for new growth. New growth will tell you that it's recovered from potting, and, well, perhaps we should say repotting and something terrible. If the growth is slow, check that you're not overwatering it, or perhaps that the soil acidity or something similar is not quite right. Repotting and ongoing nebari development will be done on a nearly annual basis, especially if there's sort of a new nursery stock. You want to repot it every year for the first 2 to 3 years. A part of this is to monitor and guide root development. The other issue is that the frequent repotting is going to be critical for developing the nebari very early on. You're also going to want to look at refining your root spread. Each time you take it out of the pot or tile you've planted it on, and you take a look at it, comb out the roots with a root rake or similar, and make sure that they are growing in a radial pattern and not doing something you don't want. If there is any new downward or crossing roots, get out your scissors and start chopping. This will reinforce lateral growth, which is what you need for the nebari to develop. Over time, you want to gradually reduce the, let's say, a height of the soil. Slowly, very slowly, exposing more and more of the roots that are developing, or at least the ones you want to be visible. You want to remove 1 to 2 millimeters of soil above them, but you don't want to expose too much of the root too quickly and too soon. At the same time, you want to adjust positioning. Now, the radial pattern is going to be important here. You want the trunk to grow reasonably evenly all around. If there is uneven growth in the trunk or roots, you're either going to have to reposition the roots and wire them to fill in the gaps, or possibly look at pruning it. Now understand, if you prune away the roots, you'll actually slow down root development, but you'll keep it even. So it's a case of deciding which is the lesser evil. This is also a reason why nursery stock can take 2 to 3 repottings to show notable and, we wouldn't say significant, but appreciable nebari progress. Now, if you're looking to try and get something done a little bit quicker, and you're willing to run risk, let's say, there are some more advanced techniques you can try. This can be more important, especially in nursery stock, that often lack any appreciable surface roots, and you may need to plan for this accordingly. The first is going to be root grafting. Now, you want to do this after the second year going into the third, if it is going to happen, and it's only if the azalea has no surface roots in certain areas. You can graft roots from azalea seedlings or cuttings for this purpose. What you do is select a seedling with a healthy root system, make a small incision at the trunk base and insert the root, then secure with raffia, possibly some sort of growth hormone, and cover with soil. This is particularly useful for nursery stock because they often have sparse or uneven root development. Another option, which is arguably more safe, is air layering. If the trunk base is too high, you lack roots, and similar, air layer just above where you want the nebari to be, and this will encourage new roots closer to the surface. This can be done in year 2 if the plant is vigorous, and you may need to wait a little bit longer, possibly into the 3rd, 4th, or even 5th year if it's a particularly slow developing specimen. The tourniquet method is easy for this because, well, it's a small specimen and trying to cut into it is difficult. So for nursery stock with a bare trunk, wrap a wire tightly around the base to stimulate root growth above the wire. You want to monitor closely to avoid girdling the trunk, but this is a reasonably easy method. Just be aware of one thing, particularly with aluminium wire, this can cause some slight acidification around it. Longer term, planning is going to be a little more, well, it's actually exactly the same thing. You're establishing radial root pattern, continuing to use the tile or shallow pot, and you're looking at health and initial root development. Years 3 to 5, you're looking at thickening the surface roots through regular repotting and gradual exposure. You may also need to consider the root graftings we've described. Years 5 through 10, refine the nebari by maintaining symmetry, tapering roots and enhancing surface exposure. The nebari should start to look defined and balanced by this point. After year 10, you should basically be where you're wanting to be. By this time, we would expect that the foliage, branch structure, and everything else has developed quite well, and all you're really doing now is focusing on how to maintain it, and possibly having to perfect the nebari's aesthetics, ensuring it complements the trunk and canopy as you've styled it. There are certain specific considerations for nursery stock. We've already mentioned some of these, but we should reinforce the concerns. Azaleas will have tangled roots, and this is because azaleas are grown specifically for being put into pots in the ground, not being used as bonsai. So make sure you take the time to untangle them during the first repotting. This is going to help you a lot in the future, and especially avoiding future issues. Azaleas have very fine and fibrous roots, and you need to handle them gently to avoid tearing and damage. You want to use sharp tools and make very precise cuts. We admit that we're rather guilty of not doing this exactly as we should, but azaleas are reasonably resilient, but they're certainly not a strong contender in that category. Acclimatization is often necessary, as nursery stock is often grown somewhere very different from where you are, and as a result, you need to make sure they have a little bit of time to get used to things. You want to transition the azalea gradually to bonsai care, especially with the light and soil conditions it will have. And finally, a nursery size. Nursery azaleas are often very small, so nebari development will start with fewer, finer roots, and these in turn will thicken over time with proper care. Common mistakes to avoid are over-pruning the roots. We mentioned earlier that the azalea does not like having too many roots removed, and we would almost argue that you're better off taking off fewer roots than you are more. So if you're not certain, you're almost better off leaving it and taking it off later than you are trying to take it off too early. This is also going to affect things like stunting growth, and if you're really unlucky, just killing the azalea. So stick to a maximum of 30 to 40% of root reduction initially. Then we have the soil. You don't want to use garden soil or anything that's got a neutral pH mix. It needs to be something at least a little bit acidic, well draining, and able to provide all the necessary materials. We then have the, let's say, eagerness you might have. That is, if you rush the nebari by exposing roots too early or too aggressively, you will hurt the plant. It will become weaker and it will grow more slowly. So you want to wait until roots are thick enough to look natural above the soil. The aftercare is another thing. We've mentioned things like, say, providing fertilizer and tonic solutions and similar, or even just ensuring it's a good location. If you don't look after the azalea after you've repotted it, it's going to be stressed and it's going to struggle, and this will slow down everything. And finally, you want to keep the canopy balanced against what you are doing. Over-pruning the foliage or leaving it too heavy will disrupt the root foliage balance. This will in turn slow nebari development. You need to be very careful with that. Tips for a successful start are, well, start small. Nursery stock azaleas are often small, so focusing on creating a proportional nebari rather than aiming for a massive root spread immediately is going to be a better approach. You want to try and document the progress. We have the advantage of making videos in Similar to show you what we do as we go, but you may not have that option. So taking pictures, writing down notes, that sort of thing is going to help you in that respect. Particularly, let's say, during repotting, mostly because you want to track nebari development and plan any adjustments for future repotting. And, well, study photos of mature azaleas to figure out what they're like, because you want to try and not necessarily achieve the same results, but use them as a goalpost. And finally, be patient. It's going to take you years to develop a nebari, especially a refined nebari, so incremental progress that takes time is much better than getting an immediate result. We did say at the start that immediate results will be very short-lived, whereas longer-term development will show you better results and more substantial results over the long term. There are a couple of common issues we want to touch on before finishing this video. Nursery stock will lack surface roots, rely on things like the tile method, and plan for root grafting in years 2, 3, or maybe even 4. Slow recovery is going to be a regular issue if you're over-eager with anything. Azaleas will show weak growth after repotting, so proper soil pH, drainage, and shade are absolutely essential. Fertilizers are less important in the first few weeks, but once recovery is evident, start using them. Uneven root growth is another problem, and you need to balance this by pruning stronger roots and encouraging weaker ones through selective soil removal and wiring. And root rot. Azaleas do not like excess water, so you want to ensure drainage is good across the board. Improve drainage by, well, start with, you can either immediately drill holes in the tile or similar, simply reducing water in parts of it, or if you really need to, treat with a fungicide. And nursery stock is especially prone to root rot if the soil is particularly heavy in what they use. Developing nebari on a new nursery stock azalea will require careful initial root work. We use the word careful because what you're going to do is going to look horrifying, but it's horrifying but effective. The strategic use of various methods to encourage that growth are also going to help, but you need to be consistent in your care of the azalea over a number of years. You want to carefully untangle the root ball, spread it out radially, use an acidic soil mix, and plan for everything you will need in the future. And planning is going to be key. The first couple of years are absolutely critical for setting everything up in terms of the future. If you get the first couple of years wrong, your foundation is going to be really bad. And in those terms, you're going to have to look at fixing it in the future. So getting things right in the very early days will give you gradual but very good progress. That does mean, however, you need patience and to pay attention, which can sometimes be a bit more of a challenge. If you are patient and you do pay the appropriate level of attention, your azalea's nebari will develop into something rather substantial, balanced, and it's a feature that enhances your azalea bonsai. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.